Chapter 6. A Case of Mistaken Identity. The few days that followed, during which Bruno undertook lessons in Miss Davenport's class, seemed to pass fairly quickly, and without as much humiliation. It was true that Bruno now felt a lot happier knowing this tutor was going to be unable to throw her accusations at him after this week. But also he noticed that she didn't seem to pounce on him anymore. In fact, she totally ignored him. Maybe Miss Grant or one of the staff had explained to her that her job at the School of the Arts was over. She'd been only temporary anyway until Mr. Shorofsky returned, but it had seemed to the kids that she'd dug her claws into the school and intended to remain there permanently. Well, it was not to be, and soon she'd be out of Bruno's life forever. Friday arrived, and it was on that particular day when Bruno arrived at the school early, as he'd been working on a synthesised piece of his own compositions and had wanted to try it out on the instrument at the school. He hadn't had time the night before, due to rather a large amount of homework he'd had to complete, which had mainly been work he'd missed when he'd taken the day off with Doris and spent it eating sandwiches in Central Park. Now, he'd had a lot of catching up to do, but Mr. Martelli's boy had always been a conscientious little worker and managed to get it all up to date. So his own music had been put aside that night. He'd arrived at the School of the Arts alone this time, because Doris had gone home to her parents on the Thursday night. One reason was because an aunt was staying with the Schwartzes, and Doris hadn't seen her for a long time. The second reason was that Bruno was fine now, and so he didn't need her comforting him any more. Oh, she planned to return to the Martellis' house for another night, and it was going to be a very special moment between them. Both she and Bruno's romance had now fully developed, and now they were ready to take the plunge. As soon as Doris could get another chance to stay with him, they were going to seal their love for one another, making sure, of course, that Mr. Martelli wouldn't be home till the very early hours of the morning. Anyway, Bruno knew his father would be extremely pleased that his son had chosen Doris as his first love. He noticed that the school was practically empty, and it looked quite eerie, especially since no one had switched the overhead lights on, so dark grey shadows loomed over the area. Bruno brushed off fears of figures lurking in the dark corners, getting ready to leap onto unsuspecting victims, and headed quite briskly towards the stairs, which would take him to the music rooms on the third floor. It was then that he spotted a light on in the teacher's lounge, which stopped him in his tracks. Hoping it was Mr. Shorofsky who'd decided to outwit the hospital staff and return to his beloved school earlier than they had planned, Bruno curiously went over to the door, and seeing as it was open, he entered. His eyes immediately focused on the piercing, bright green ones belonging to none other than Miss Davenport. A slight sense of panic shot through him, and he stammered a little. I'm sorry, I thought Shorofsky was back." On hearing those words, Miss Davenport's eyes glowed brighter, so Bruno felt he had to leave, as of now. Making his way to the door which led to freedom, he said, "Excuse me," and was just about to leave when the temporary tutor spoke. "Mr. Martelli, I need to speak to you, please." Her voice had lost those high-pitched, shrill notes he was so used to hearing. Instead, she sounded calm, almost on the verge of tears. Bruno didn't know what to do, so just remained by the door, looking at her. "Bruno, please shut the door and come and listen to me," she said, sounding almost like she was begging. That was a new one too, Bruno. It was the first time she'd ever called him by his Christian name. He felt confused as to why she'd suddenly changed her attitude, but decided it wouldn't harm him to stay and listen. So he closed the door behind him and sat down opposite her at the table. He still felt he wanted to keep his distance from her, even though she didn't seem like she was going to hurl abuse at him. "I'm listening," he said quietly. Miss Davenport began her speech, which straight away started as a confession. "Bruno, I know it's going to sound ridiculous, but I want to apologise to you for the way I've treated you." Bruno couldn't believe his own ears. She'd been a cruel monster to him throughout the days she'd met him, and now she was saying she was sorry. "I've been told that my duty here is over, and I want to make it up to you before I have to leave." Bruno decided to make conversation, only he still felt very unsure by her change of mood. "Make it up to me," he began. "Miss Davenport, you mark my work wrongly. You've caused me a great deal of stress. I don't understand you." Bruno, I know, and I feel very guilty because of what I've done, but I want to right the wrongs while there's still time. Miss Davenport went on, showing a deep amount of concern for the pupil she'd only recently loved to hate. Bruno swallowed, feeling uneasy. Why would she just want to be kind just like that? I still don't understand, he admitted, confused. Listen, 12 years ago, when I was married to my first husband, I gave birth to a young boy. I wanted a daughter, but you can't have everything you want in life. She laughed, but it was tinged with bitterness. Bruno listened, but couldn't understand what the hell it had to do with him being treated so badly by her. She went on. We called him Ramon, and I loved him so much. He was Italian, my first husband. We brought Ramon up here in New York. So Bruno had the same nationality, the same Italian blood in him. So what? The marriage didn't last very long, and so along came my second husband. But unfortunately he hated my son, and used to beat him, till he cried out in pain. I loved him dearly, Ramon. By now Bruno was sensing that there wasn't something quite right with Miss Davenport. It was the way she seemed lost in another world as she spoke about Ramon. Only when she was telling him the part about the son being beaten, her eyes seemed to sparkle as if she enjoyed talking about it. Then, without any warning, she changed her attitude. Bruno, you know something? I didn't really want that kid. In fact, the little bastard should never have been born at all. He was a mistake and caused me hell ever since. Her voice was getting angrier, and Bruno just couldn't do anything but stare at the way the woman was acting. It was scary, to say the least, and he knew he didn't want to stay in the room with her any longer. Slowly he got up, but she stopped him. Bruno, don't go. You must hear this. Why must I? Bruno asked, totally confused. Please hear me out. Bruno felt trapped by her pleas, so returned to his seat as she continued her tale. It was an accident. What was? Ramon died while crossing the road. I bought a new car and was giving it its first run. He just stepped out and the verdict was accidental death. I'm sorry, Bruno said, wondering what else he could say. He'd never seen the tutor act this way before, and it was even safe to assume that the woman was a little, if not totally disturbed over this Ramon, her dead son. I'm a Catholic, and I prayed to God for forgiveness. You see, Bruno, I killed him. I wanted to kill him. You do understand me, don't you? He was a wicked child, and I hated him. Dear God, now Bruno was absolutely convinced the woman was insane, so just nodded in weak reply, unaware of how he could get out of the situation he was in, without causing her to have a mental breakdown, or even worse, hurt him in any way. Miss Davenport seemed to be filled with rage, but it simmered down to be replaced with tears. Then she just burst out sobbing right in front of him. Bruno felt frightened and concerned and thought he'd better go and find help. Again he attempted to leave, but she called to him. No, no, Ramon! You promised you'd never leave me again! Bruno spun round from where he'd made it to the door and faced her. What had she called him? Ramon? Oh, God, Bruno thought. She thinks of me as a son. That's why she'd been unkind to him in music class. That's why she'd marked his work with E's and F's and constantly picked on him. To her, he was her dead son, and from what Bruno had gathered from her speech, she hated him. Inside he began to panic, but he didn't want to show her how frightened he'd suddenly become, so carefully he turned the door handle, intending to get out as fast as possible. No, she cried, making him jump. Let go of the handle. Please, Ramon, forgive me. Can't you forgive your own mother? She pleaded in between sobs. She was a pitiful sight, and Bruno felt sorry for her. Perhaps if he pretended to be Ramon, he could calm her and then go and get help. If he'd stopped to think seriously, he might not have attempted this task. But Bruno couldn't register anything but the fact that right before him was a wretched creature in need of some comfort. In his mind he clearly heard the words, "You're an idiot, Martelli, don't do it." But his body wasn't listening, and cautiously he walked over to Miss Davenport and stood before her. She was still in floods of tears. Then she looked up and took hold of his hand. Squeezing it gently, she cried, "Oh, Ramon, I'm so sorry." Although he was scared, he played the role of a son and replied, "I'm sorry too, Mother." Bruno, what the hell are you doing? Why don't you just go and find help? He kept asking himself. but he couldn't obey his own orders and remained next to the tutor, who was still holding onto his hand, weeping heartbrokenly. "You understand, don't you?" she said almost affectionately, to which Bruno nodded unconvincingly. "You know why I had to kill you? Because I didn't like you, Ramon. In fact, I hated you a lot." Her grip on Bruno's hand began to tighten. "You destroyed everything!" she suddenly yelled, taking him completely by surprise. "You ruined my life, and you didn't care, did you? No, you never cared about your own mother. That's why I killed you. I hated you. I despised you. I loathed you, Ramon." Fear shot through Bruno like a spear entering the heart, and panicking he tried to make her loosen her grip, but failed. The woman wasn't in her right mind, and by the sounds of things she was dangerous too. Her grip was like steel, and she was hurting him. "Please, let me go," Bruno said, alarmed, his heart racing madly. Now he was really scared, but try as he might, he couldn't break free. "Let me go," he said again. But words were useless, so he tried another means of escape, by attempting to convince her that he wasn't her dead son. "I'm Bruno, not Ramon. Please, I'm Bruno Martelli," he pleaded. But she kept his hand firmly in her strong grip. "Why did you destroy me?" she asked, demanding an answer. I didn't destroy you," Bruno replied weakly, still trying to escape. "Ramon, I hate you." I'm not Ramon, I'm Bruno." He tried again, but it was no use. Suddenly, without least expecting it, Miss Davenport reached into a top drawer of a desk behind her and pulled out an object. Bruno couldn't tell of its nature until she aimed it at him. He saw a glint of metal and realised it was a large, sharp steel knife. His reflexes acted faster than they'd ever acted in his life, and his strength suddenly doubled, enabling him to pull free from the woman's hold, whereupon he fell backwards over a chair which had been sat behind him and onto the cold floor, hitting his head quite sharply as he did so. This stunned him only for a while, because he realised Miss Davenport was not going to let up, and it was pretty obvious she intended to kill him. She threw herself at him, yelling, "You deserve to die, Ramon!" But Bruno, panicking, rolled to one side so the knife just missed him by an inch or so. He saw the door. That was his only escape. So terrified, he staggered towards it, but Miss Davenport seemed to have developed the agility of an eel, and quick as a flash she reached the door before him and locked it. Then, knife waving in her hand, she faced him. "Ramon, you have to die. I'm sorry." With that she plunged the knife at Bruno again and missed again. This time he reached the door, but of course couldn't escape because she'd locked it. So he began hammering on it, begging someone to hear him. "Help! Help me!" he screamed, as loud as his vocal cords would allow. But the woman intended to win, so threw herself at Bruno again. He saw it coming and jumped to one side as the knife came down again, neatly missing him by an inch. As he moved, he tripped up on a wire leading to a table lamp and fell against the table leg with a hard and painful thud. The lamp came crashing down and glass showered everywhere. In his panic, Bruno put his hand onto fragments of the glass, immediately cutting it. But at that particular moment in time, a small cut wasn't going to bother him. No, he was more concerned with preventing a crazed tutor from plunging a knife into his heart. It was about that moment when Miss Lydia Grant was arriving up the steps with Mr. David Reardon in tow. As they entered the lobby discussing a Broadway show they'd both seen on TV last night, she heard scuffles but couldn't place where they were coming from. A small wave of fear flowed over her, as she'd come across burglars in the school before, or rather Mr. Shorofsky had, who one time had been attacked by some creep whilst he'd been checking the rooms. David stopped his conversation when he noticed her face. "What's wrong?" he asked. Then he too heard the scuffles and then a sudden yell. "David," Lydia said worriedly, "the sound is coming from the teacher's lounge." Together they made their way over to the door and were stopped in their tracks when they heard another yell. It was a cry for help, and Lydia recognised the voice now. "David, it's Bruno! Bruno's in there!" she exclaimed, terribly concerned. They heard Bruno's cry once more. "Help me, someone!" Without a moment to lose, Reardon tried the door, only to find it locked firmly. All the commotion had caused kids to gather round, wondering what on earth was going on. Amongst them were Coco, Danny, Leroy and Doris, who had just arrived. "What's happening?" she whispered to Coco, but the Puerto Rican girl couldn't give her an answer. But when Doris heard Lydia yell out a name full of concern and worry, mixed in with fear, her heart nearly stopped. "Bruno!" Miss Grant yelled. From inside, Bruno heard her, but so did Miss Davenport, who was by now leaning right over him, the knife held firmly in her hand. He couldn't move, so lay there, utterly helpless. Deep inside he was begging someone to save him from certain death. On the outside, Reardon knew he had to get into that room, so motioned kids to move out of the way so he could take a running leap at the door and hopefully break it down. He tried, but failed. Inside, Miss Davenport realised they were trying to break in, so she moved closer to Bruno, leant down and placed the knife against his throat. He was trembling violently, but couldn't prevent her from taking his life. All he could do was try begging, which was bloody useless, but what else could he do? "Please," he stammered, terrified. Miss Davenport smiled. "I have to do this," she whispered by his ear. Bruno forced himself to close his eyes. It was over. In a few seconds or so he'd feel the cold blade cut across his throat, ending his life. Shivering violently, he made his final prayer to the heavens, when suddenly he heard a splintering of wood as the door broke open. Reardon ran into the room to discover Bruno lying on the floor with a knife at his throat, being held in the hand of the temporary music tutor, Miss Davenport. "Dear God!" She spun round to face him, tears streaming from her eyes, and lifting the knife from Bruno's throat, she began sobbing hysterically. I didn't mean to hurt him. I loved him, you see. I didn't want to kill him." She was, of course, referring to Ramon, but from outside the door, Lydia believed the words to mean that she'd killed Bruno. Sternly she told the kids, who were just as upset, to stay where they were. Then she entered the room to find Mr. Reardon stood facing Miss Davenport, and Bruno lying on the floor behind her. She noticed almost at once that he hadn't yet been seriously harmed, so breathed a small prayer. "Oh, thank God." David Reardon slowly approached the grief-stricken tutor and took the knife from her hand with no problem. I didn't want to kill my son. I loved Ramon." Yes, I understand," Reardon said calmly, and took her by the hand, whereupon he led her out of the room. The moment it was clear, Lydia went over to Bruno, who was still in shock, so she knelt down and took his shaking body into her comforting arms. "Oh, Bruno, she can't hurt you now. You're going to be all right, love. It's all right now." Bruno clung to her, needing her strong support, and burst out crying. Outside the room, Doris confronted Mr. Reardon, extremely upset. She noticed Miss Davenport's look of anxiety and the tears streaming from her eyes, but her concern was for Bruno. "He's all right, isn't he?" "He will be," David replied, then led the tutor towards one of the English rooms. "Go and fetch the police," he told the student, who immediately obeyed his command. Without any hesitation, Doris ran into the teacher's lounge, followed by the rest of the group, and discovered Bruno being rocked gently in Lydia's arms. Throwing herself down by the two of them, Doris took over from Miss Grant and held him tightly in her safe protection, so that no one could harm him ever again.